Okay, good morning.
Morning.
So, uh, this is a little odd. I'm used to being in Chris's spot. Um, and I think the first thing I wanted to just say is actually happy birthday to Toto-san. I think it's actually today, right? And Yuko soon, it's her birthday, right?
Yuko's birthday was already passed.
Oh, it already
The
passed.
16th is
Okay.
Monday.
Okay. Yeah, so I hope this Dharma talk is an okay part of your day anyway. That goes for everyone. Um, and also wanted to just acknowledge that yesterday, GK, one of Okumura Roshi's students, did a Hosen Shiki ceremony in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with Cone Franz, who himself underwent a mountain seat ceremony to formally become the abbot at Thousand Harbors Zen. And we know Cone from when he came. He's been here several times, but he came and actually led our nyoho workshop in early January. So this is kind of a auspicious occasion. And on top of that, it's also the summer solstice, or near the summer solstice. It was bright at 6:30 this morning, so I was awake for more than one reason. So I think everyone here knows that I work here, and it's a really interesting job for more than one reason. And one of the things that I've learned is actually a very important part of my job is being a sounding board for Hoko. So every now and then, every few weeks, we'll go to the Cloverleaf or sit upstairs in the common room and start talking about this place and the calendar and what's coming up, and we'll realize that 3 hours have passed. So in the midst of I think this was maybe very early on this year, as we were planning how our study of nyoho, nyoho as our theme for this year, the dharma of thusness, or being in accord with dharma. As we know, those traditionally are seen in three faces. So we have clothing, food, and shelter. And clothing we kind of focused on during the first 4 months of the year. Now we're in the section focusing on food, and then we'll kind of turn to shelter later in the year. But anyway, discussing the food calendar with Hoko, I remember at some point in that conversation, Hoko kind of looked over it to me and she just said, "I think we need to hear from you." And I was a little surprised, but I was also thought, okay, actually maybe that does make sense. There's a small sentence in my job description that says it's listed under event coordination, and it says coordinate any food for the event, assuring that cooks are assigned for each meal, working with practice leadership, local volunteers, and food vendors as necessary. And I kind of took that and ran with it. Now we're, working with others, working with Hoko, working with Esho, especially in the kitchen. Now we've got sort of local farm partnerships. We've got a community garden plot up the road that I kind of organize volunteers around. And we also have pretty well-defined oryoki meal guidelines for Sesshin, which is what that handout goes over. So we'll be talking about that later. I won't be able to cover that entire thing. There's a lot of words there. So all of that is a lot of activity. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. It's quite a large chunk of what I'm employed to do here in that one little sentence. So as I was thinking about what to say today, I thought basically I need to answer the question, what is the dharma of all of that? What is the nyoho of all of that activity? There's a sentence in Tenzo Kyokun where Dogen is talking about cooking, but it applies to this too. So in cooking, he says, unless you have the mind of the way, basically you're going to all this effort for no reason. You're wasting your effort and time. So when I'm running around sending emails to local farms or trying to teach people how to cook in the kitchen or printing out handouts for how to plan a nyoho meal, what's the dharma of all of that effort? And I think ultimately, if you want to pull one thing out of this talk, I hope it's that food demonstrates interconnection, and including with the world outside the zendo. I think that's an important aspect of it. So it demonstrates interconnection, it demonstrates impermanence, and it does this in a very literally on the ground, down to earth, tasteable way. So in other words, it's tangible thusness, basically. Hoko wrote a article, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, was published by Buddha Dharma, and it's called "The Taste of Thusness." And she actually goes into a lot of that nyoho menu planning. So food teaches interconnection. Just like Zazen. So recently I participated in it was called a community foraging class. It was put on by a local organization around here called Soulcraft. And it happened to happen on Tuesday evenings when I should have been sewing my okesa with Esho. But I took this 6 weeks and kind of did something outside of this place, which was interesting. But inevitably I related it back to, we're studying food right now. So it's all relevant. And it was a really interesting experience. We would basically, there were 7 or 8 of us, and this woman who leads that organization, Monique, she has all this knowledge about local edible plants. And we would meet at a different location around Bloomington. We went to the community orchard. We went out to, what's the name of the lake on the north side? Griffey Lake. And we just walked around and stopped at different locations where edible plants were growing. And we would gather them up, and then for the last maybe hour or half an hour, we would set ourselves up on the ground somewhere and uh, chop up leaves and start camp stoves and basically make a little meal out of food we had just plucked out of the ground and that we had given no effort into growing either. And one of the really interesting things that I took away from that series was one thing that Monique kind of said, kind of offhand, but she said that we can look at basically all plants as existing on a spectrum from food to medicine. You might also add poison in there, but food is basically, it's a plant that you can eat and you can put, more or less any amount into your body and it gives you nutrition, but it doesn't necessarily have an extremely powerful effect. Medicine is kind of where a tiny amount will have a profound effect on your biological chemistry. And poison, of course, will too. It's interesting to note, by the way, that medicine is, so if we think of the three faces of nyoho, clothing, food, shelter, there's also a teaching, I think it's called the four requisites sometimes. It's what lay people would traditionally donate to monks to keep them alive and practicing. And so it's clothing, food, shelter, and medicine. So another kind of layer there. Food and medicine have a kind of relationship. And what this kind of showed me and made me realize a little more directly is that everything is food. At least everything alive on some level is being eaten by someone. The other day, I think I was leaving here and going home, arrived in the parking lot outside of my apartment, and there's a bunch of rabbits that live around just on the little plot of grass in between two buildings. And I drove up and there was a rabbit there, and I try not to sort of startle them away whenever I see them. And this one kind of stopped, as I drove up. But then I sat there still enough just watching it, and until it felt comfortable to just start eating. So what it was doing was just sitting there munching on grass and clover. I saw it sort of suck up a little clover flower. Apparently that's food. And so when you can encounter the world in that way, walking around the world and just be like, everything is food. Everything is ultimately something that can be broken down and incorporated into the body of something else. So that's food as interconnection, basically. Okay, so I'm kind of organizing this around a few snippets of conversations that I had as I was thinking about this Dharma talk. These three little conversations were moving around my mind. The first one was recently in our community garden plot. with Hoko, actually, we were planting arugula and lettuce and kale, I think, and Hoko, mostly we were just quietly planting. But at some point, Hoko just kind of said out of the blue, this is another great way to remind us that Sesshin is not about individuals achieving a personal peak experience. And at first I was like, whoa, that's what a leap. It's like, wow, where did that teaching just come from? But I didn't say anything, and I just kind of let that linger with me over the next few weeks. So we'll get to that, and then the other little snippet I wanted to mention is maybe a couple of weeks ago, up in Todo-san's office, I needed to get him to sign a check that we had written out to Seven Ridges Farm, which is this nearby farm that we're kind of partnering with to get produce for Sesshin. And I was explaining to Todo-san what we were doing and say, okay, so we need to sign this check. And the first thing he said was, do you get to choose the vegetables? So again, there's a teaching there. And then the last kind of conversation, we'll see if I get to all of this, by the way. Time is passing. But the last conversation was also in the community garden with Owen, and we were talking sort of about how modern life seems to put certain impediments into there's certain impediments associated with the way we exist in contemporary society that seem to kind of get in the way of practice in certain ways. And what Owen said was, how am I supposed to practice nyoho food when I can just pull up my phone and order DoorDash whenever I want? So maybe we'll be able to see if it's possible for DoorDash to be nyoho. Okay, so back to the garden with Hoko, and so she said, this is another great way to show us that Sesshin is not about achieving a personal peak experience. And as I kind of played with that, I thought, okay, what that means is food has something very real to teach us about the meaning of Sesshin. I remember another time during either a board meeting or a joint leadership meeting on Zoom, and Hoko talking about Sesshin, she was saying, Sesshin shows us or asks the question, what does it take to live? And I think those two comments are connected. Sesshin in a certain way is like going back to basics. And in that way, I think it actually mirrors these traditional three faces of nyoho that we're looking at. Clothing, food, and shelter, the most basic kind of things that we need as human beings. During Sesshin, all we do is eat and sleep and sit, mostly sit, and also commute back and forth, most of us. And we do all of that silently. So basically for 3 or 5 or 7 days, we are sitting on the ground of clothing, food, and shelter. We're just being the dharma, and we're being the dharma in community. We become very intimate with our own 5 aggregates, everything that's coming and going within this body and mind. And in another way, we're becoming intimate with all beings, including the small group of beings in the Zendo, small group of human beings anyway. And we do that, and we let go of self-clinging. So that's Sesshin. And so Sesshin, like basically what it is we're seamlessly folding into community. And I think that's kind of the key part of what I see and what Hoko was saying is that Sesshin is not about me personally sitting and facing the wall and achieving a great personal breakthrough into awakening. That's not out of bounds, but that's not the point of Sesshin. Sesshin is completely not separating from the reality of this moment, which includes everything and everyone else here. So sometimes we talk about having functional speech during Sesshin. So we try to be as silent as possible, but sometimes things need to be communicated. And so we communicate that in the most kind of direct, simple way to simply do what we need to do to function. And I think that's actually kind of what Sesshin is in general. It's like we're being a very purely functional community. We're being a profoundly functional community. All we're doing is manifesting and maintaining our life force. We're basically like a small group of people trying not to get in the way of each other's awakening. And in a way, it can appear like to be a very strange and extreme and kind of irrelevant activity. But actually, it's just a really concentrated form of everyday life. And we get to sort of see that unfold, experience that. And in our style of Sesshin, where we're just sitting 14 periods a day, we're together in the same room for, I guess, 17 hours a day. And we have 3 meals during that time. So when meals are surrounded by silence and sitting, it starts to become really clear how dependent you are on that food. It becomes really clear that in order to stay alive, to continue to just manifest your life force, we need to put other forms of life into our mouth. That's a quote from somebody on the Soto Shu website describing food practice. I was struck by that. He said, we need to put other forms of life into our mouth. And so if we're putting other forms of life into our bodies and minds, it makes sense to ask the question, where is that life coming from? And during Sesshin, most of us, for most of the time, can basically completely let go of what we sometimes call picking and choosing. So we just follow the bells that tell us when to sit, when to walk, when to get up and eat a delicious home-cooked meal, when to go to sleep. And so usually it's someone else is kind of taking care of all of the necessities, making the decisions and distinctions that allow everyone else to just sit and drop the need to make decisions and distinctions and just immerse in basic reality. And it's important to say, like, that itself is an offering too. Even if you're the one just being sort of taken care of, it's certainly not easy to sit Sesshin, although I once heard Todo-san call it a vacation. But it's also a lot of effort, and it's an offering. It's a way of being, another kind of phrase I like, being the foundation of happiness for human and heavenly beings. Dogen said that. In the most fundamental way, that's what we're doing in Sesshin. So that is an offering, just sitting. But what about the practitioners who are making those decisions and distinctions and holding the structure? Ultimately, they are doing Sesshin too. And there's no way to kind of separate whether it's the person cooking the meals in the kitchen or over the whole growing season working in the garden, growing the food that ends up in those bowls that supports our sitting. So food is community, just like Sesshin. Okay, so now we can jump up into Todo-san's office, where I had to get this check signed for Seven Ridges Farm, and I told him about our process, and he asked, "Do you get to choose the vegetables that you receive from this farm?" And so to sort of, that was another thing where I was just like, well, and let that sit with me. And I think to start to explore this territory, I'm going to pull out this book, Living by Vow. So there's a chapter in here, this is by Okumura Roshi. There's a chapter in here where he discusses the meal verses. And as part of the chants that we do during a formal meal, during Sesshin we don't do these chants because we're completely silent, of course. But come next Sunday if you want to participate in the actual chanting. But there's a sentence in that chant that's part of the 5 contemplations, and it goes, "We reflect on the effort that brought us this food and consider how it comes to us." So, I think here I want to just kind of read a little bit and let Todo-san do the Dharma talk a little bit. So as he's discussing this phrase, he kind of goes into the history of how Buddhist monks received food. So he talks about how in India, Buddhist monks neither produced food nor prepared meals. So they were not involved in growing food, and they were not involved in even cooking food. Every day after morning meditation practice, they went to town to beg for food. Farming was prohibited for monks because farmers have to kill living beings while cultivating the land. Monks simply received the food offered by lay people. So that's how it was that's kind of the situation in which the Buddha kind of gathered up his Sangha and then functioned with his Sangha. There was kind of a tradition of that before Buddha. But then Toda-san goes on to say that in China, it's said that Zen monks began to cultivate grains and vegetables to support their practice. This is kind of the origin of the famous Zen saying, "A day without work is a day without eating." So in the traditional Zen monastery, the monks who grew grains and vegetables and prepared the meals were givers, and the rest of the monks received their offerings. And he goes into kind of the larger view, which is they usually, or maybe always, were never self-sufficient. Monasteries became large institutions. They got government support. There were all sorts of relationships with lay people donating food, or temples owning large tracts of lands that were rented out to lay farmers who, so as a source of income, basically. So, but then this is the interesting part that I want to just kind of read word for word, because it talks about here and now. So today at American Zen centers, practitioners pay to participate in sesshin and retreats. Food provided during the retreat is purchased with this money, so participants may not consider the food they eat as a gift or think of themselves as recipients. Rather, they may think they are purchasing a service. And yet, if we think carefully about this matter, we realize that we cannot buy food if farmers do not work. And if the weather does not support growing plants, farmers cannot produce crops. Plants need water, air, fertilizer, earthworms, microorganisms, etc. All the elements in the network of interdependent origination support the farmer's work. All food we receive is a gift from nature. And after the food is grown, we need people to transport it to the marketplace and then to factories to be processed and the various places where consumers shop. On highways, we see countless trucks carrying commercial products. Without all these people's work, we could not eat even a single grain of rice. There are also factors beyond those we can see on the earth. Because of the distance between the sun and the earth, we receive just the right amount of heat. If we had more or less, we could not live the way we live now. This distance is a result of the balance among the planets in the solar system working together. So again, food is interconnectedness. When we consider these interconnections, we see that our existence itself is a gift from the network of all beings. And all beings are sort of working together, but also kind of eating each other, serving each other. That's kind of how life works, which is a problem because you have to take the life of something else in order to maintain your own life. So our community garden plot, it's been interesting to, as it's unfolded, I've not entirely been sure what to call it. So sometimes I'll call it the Sangha garden, sometimes it's the temple garden, but I think my favorite way of calling it is actually the Sesshin garden, um, because it reminds me that, well, it makes me ask the question, like, what if growing food for Sesshin is doing Sesshin in the same way that cooking food for Sesshin is doing Sesshin? At least the garden is very much not separate from Sesshin. It's directly connected. We can talk to each other during it. We don't have to be silent. But if we can sort of maintain that attitude while we're there working in the garden, then Sesshin is on that ground. So a little bit about the connections that we've started to form outside of just that community garden plot. Actually, interestingly, I think the first time that I was involved anyway in sourcing food for a Sesshin locally, it was from Eric. Eric and Rose are friends of mine who have done a lot of farming and gardening over the years, and I think it was when I was living as a resident here, and I was the cook for a Sesshin, and I was like, what if we just go over to their place and see what they have and bring it over and use that during Sesshin? So now I think it's been maybe 2 or 2.5 years of kind of trying to make that work. And it does take some work and intention. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 farms now that we've connected with, and the way it works, the way it has worked is I'll kind of reach out to that farm either from going to the farmer's market or finding their email on their website and getting in touch with them and letting them know we're interested in sourcing from them. And then I just ask, what's growing? What do you have available right now? In that way, we don't get to choose. It is, we work with what's available. That's kind of a key component of nyoho, I think. There's a certain humility in that. So 4 or 5 farms we've been in touch with directly. Sometimes I'll go to the farmer's market and just kind of shop around. We also happen to have in Bloomington a grocery store that offers local produce 7 days a week. So in Bloomington, we're quite, there's a lot of availability of local produce. And then again, it's probably only like less than 1% of all the food that gets eaten in Bloomington, because of the way that our basically global food system functions. So in our very kind of small way, we're making these little connections with the land that surrounds us, that is very nearby. And what we're doing now, actually, with Seven Ridges, is we're even more not picking and choosing, in that we've kind of set up an arrangement where we've just paid them ahead of time for the next 3 Sesshin and retreats, and basically a week before, they just give us $75 worth of produce that we've already paid for. And it's up to us to figure out how to put that into people's bowls. Sorry, Esho. It takes some work. But it's something that you can kind of only pull off with a certain amount of experienced practitioners around. It's harder to pull off when we're not residents also. But it worked pretty well last Sesshin. So, okay, I need to just sort of move along here. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is another part of the meal verse, which is we only actually chant this during a formal lunch meal. So I've actually never chanted it. I realized the only times I've done formal oryoki meals with chanting has been for breakfast. So I've never chanted this, but there's a part that says, the 3 virtues and 6 tastes of this meal are offered to the Buddha and Sangha. So this is where I'm going to start to kind of venture a little bit into that handout. It's interesting to note that the 3 virtues and 6 tastes can be traced back to the Nirvana Sutra. So this is the Mahayana Nirvana Sutra, and I actually went and tried to track down. I'd heard that was the case, so now I went to actually track down that quote, and I found that the scene that's going on is basically everyone knows that the Buddha is about to pass away. He's about to die. He's about to enter parinirvana, and everyone is freaking out. But it's also sort of a great occasion, and all the myriad bodhisattvas and monks and lay people and everyone is gathering to hear kind of his last teachings. And one of the things they do is they serve a meal for the Buddha and the Sangha. And so I'll just kind of read. This is from a translation by Yamamoto, I think. So he says, they carried in various utensils to prepare meals for the Buddha and the Sangha. The cooking was done with sandalwood and aloe wood as fuel. The dishes were sweet and beautiful in 6 tastes: bitter, sour, sweet, hot, salty, and plain. Also, the virtues were 3: 1, light and soft; 2, pure; and 3, true to cuisine. So an interesting note here is that 3rd virtue, which is being translated as true to cuisine, is actually nyoho. So so then I went and looked up other translations, and so I found one that had everything basically the same, but then it translated that 3rd virtue as like the dharma. There's other places where it's translated. It's translated in How to Cook Your Life, the translation of Uchiyama Roshi's commentary on Tenzo Kyokun. It's translated in Okumura Roshi's and Dan Layton's Eihei Shingi. In that text, it's translated as, so the 3 virtues refer to food that is soft, clean, and in accord with dharma, in parentheses, prepared appropriately. And then in How to Cook Your Life, that nyoho is translated as conscientious and thorough. So another way that we've kind of approached nyoho here, it's interesting to see how, in the very earliest usages of nyoho, it probably, I think, wasn't being used as specifically as we've come to start embodying it here in this Sangha, and in there's several training temples in Japan that really kind of emphasize this way of engaging the Dharma. And so if you look at the handout, you'll see written out Tai, Shiki, and Ryo. So we kind of think of these as the three, where do I have, there it is. So we have those three faces of nyoho: clothing, food, and shelter. But then we have these three aspects of nyoho, which is Tai, materials, Shiki, colors, and Ryo is size or amount. So these are kind of like, to me, what I see in these three things in terms of food anyway is this is how we prepare a meal appropriately in a formal setting. In a like during Sesshin is again, it's a concentrated form of our life. So during Sesshin, we're kind of being very attentive to all these elements of the meals that, in a sense, it's like we're reenacting the Buddha's last meal in a way. Every time we sit down and do a formal meal, we're feeding the Buddha, and we're keeping the Buddha alive in our own practice. So I'm not going to go into all of these details. This is something that I wanted to just kind of like launch out into the Sangha, because this is something that we work with whenever we're training individual cooks, to kind of show them what goes into planning the meal. And I remember giving this to Clark. Clark was not here, but he looked at it and he was like, whoa, I did not expect that this much goes into just making breakfast for Sesshin. But you can see, on that sample menu, you can kind of see how all of those things, the materials used, the color of the food, the amount, all gets kind of considered basically conscientiously and thoroughly. We are, and it's true that not every single time do I make a chart and plop everything into its right place. But it can be a really helpful exercise. For a while, I was kind of like stuck because this felt like I had to do all this like intellectual picking and choosing. I had to do all this figuring out of where everything fits. But it's kind of like the same thing as doing an oryoki meal. There's all these different things that you have to consider. Where do you put your chopsticks? When do you pick up this bowl? When do you do this? And ultimately you start to just fold into it. It becomes part of your practice, and you don't. And this becomes a way of actually not picking and choosing. It becomes a way of, I'm not planning this meal based on some random idea in my mind of I like this or I don't like this, or this is what I had yesterday and maybe it'll work. Although that can be helpful sometimes. This becomes a kind of framework that we just give ourselves to. Just like in Zazen, we just give ourselves to the posture. in this case, we give ourselves to this kind of structure. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to just drop in is a quote from Tenzo Kyokun that was helpful in that, in this, as I was working with this, which was, Dogen says, while examining the rice, so he's talking in times when, you know, rice was not necessarily like cleaned in an industrial facility before it reached the temple. So he says, while examining the rice, watch for sand. While examining the sand, watch for rice, and basically pick out the little pebbles. And he says, if you minutely observe from different viewpoints without absent-mindedness, then naturally the food will integrate the three virtues and include the six tastes. So that was kind of relieving to me. For a while I was like, I gotta fit all this stuff in here. But if you think of it as sort of like just conscientiously separating the rice from the grains of sand, then you just do it. Okay, so I should probably stop talking soon, but I want to at least touch on the last little conversation snippet with Owen, spreading mulch on the pathways in the garden, and at some point he just asked, how are we supposed to practice nyoho food when I can just pull out my phone and order DoorDash? And the way that I sort of interpret that is sort of like, who has the time to put all this care and attention and effort into 3 meals a day in the midst of our lives? Another thing, who has the money? Is one thing that we're purchasing food locally, it's more expensive. And how much more expensive is kind of interesting. Like, I think we kind of assume it's like way exorbitantly more expensive. Sometime for something that's a little nearer than I expected when I kind of looked at it, like a bunch of collard greens for $3.50 instead of $2.99. But it is an investment of time, money, attention to put this kind of care into what you eat for breakfast. And so, yeah, so I think it's a really valid question. And I think it helps to remember that, again, that Sesshin is it's almost like the way we do food during Sesshin is a kind of a ceremonial, a ritual activity. And part of that, and the point of ritual, or a point of ritual, is to sort of remind us of what actually is this reality that we're living in. It brings us into a certain structure that helps us understand, in our case, Buddha's teaching. And so when we're trying to make all these connections locally, when we're planning a menu that is so minute and careful, it's a kind of a concentrated ceremonial way of approaching food. So this does not need to be what you do every day. It actually probably can't be. It would not be healthy. But is it possible for DoorDash to be nyoho? Is it possible for fast food in the world that we live in? I wrote down here, living in a funyo world. So we have nyoho, which is, being in accord with dharma, and we have this other term, funyo, which means the fu just means not. So the question of whether things can be not the dharma is an interesting one. If you go to Sanshin's source on the page about nyoho, it gives a little basic definition of nyoho and funyo. And so what Hoko said here is, nyoho is something consistent with or the same as the dharma. The opposite is funyo. Fu makes a word negative. Funyo is something out of step with the dharma, something that's gone amiss or gone awry. So living in a funyo world, I think this is kind of a koan of our life in modern industrial society. Can we sort of be in step with things that are out of step? Can we maintain balance and work to maintain balance for ourselves and others in the midst of a world that feels very imbalanced, that in some ways feels like it's kind of falling apart? Can we remain grounded, and can we remain humble? Can we practice in the midst of all that? So when we're just, walking through the grocery store aisles, when we're eating out at a restaurant, when we're having a peanut butter sandwich at home for lunch in the middle of doing something else, can we, or when we're going to the farmer's market, or if we happen to know farmer friends like Eric, can we experience food as dharma? We can sort of bring a kind of a dharma inquiry into how we're interacting with all the elements of our world, but particularly food is a gate. We can say, what is in accord? Maybe that means what is in season. I mean, I grew up completely oblivious to seasonality of food. Food was just what was on the shelves in the pantry or at the grocery store, had no connection with where that came from or when it would be growing. I just didn't think about it because our world doesn't require that of us. But something is lost there, some kind of connection is lost there. So we can think, where did this banana come from? And what's the meaning of a cabbage that's grown in your backyard or just outside of town? We can do things like the way that I connected with Seven Ridges Farm actually is I'm a member of their CSA. CSA means Community Supported Agriculture, and it's like having a subscription to a farm where, again, you don't pick and choose, you just receive on a weekly basis. You pay up front, and then on a weekly basis you go pick up either at the farm or at the market or somewhere a week's worth of whatever they have growing, whatever is growing in their ground. So there's CSAs all around in Bloomington. It's not easy, actually. My refrigerator right now is full of things, more full than it should be, because you have to really figure out how to put all of this food to use. You have to cook. So I think it's important to remember, one of the kind of fundamental aspects of nyoho is what Hoko described as unpretentious and unassuming. So there's a way in which actually, like, making sure all your food is local, and you go to the farmer's market and fork over a lot of cash to buy the best quality stuff. There's a way in which it can go into being pretentious. So remembering that what's going on here is I actually thought about having a collard green leaf just sitting here next to me during the talk as a very unpretentious and unassuming object from the garden. I thought it would be a little distracting though. So remembering that ultimately what this is about is humility and groundedness and seeing interconnection. Can we encounter the 6 tastes in our everyday meals? I've been really into radicchio lately because it is so directly bitter. There's no negotiating with it. You just sense it. So that's pretty much all I want to say. I think I wanted to kind of reference Shoto's talk a little bit. Shoto gave a talk on Thursday evening, which was very different from talks we normally hear. And basically what she was talking about is living in a funyo world, the society we live in being in many ways out of step, out of balance, and what can we do in the midst of all of that, disconnected from nature, and what do we do? And she shared kind of like her vision, her sort of, she called it a dream, and what she imagined was sort of groups of people all over the world. She has a small group, sometimes it's just herself, but a small group of people who are practicing with her in Minnesota. And she imagined groups like that kind of popping up all over the world that, so her group is called Mountains and Waters Alliance. And it has to do with becoming part of reintegrating into the family of life, into the community of life and all beings. And she imagined that happening in different places all over the world, everyone having kind of their own practices and rituals that support that kind of alliance of mountains and waters. And it kind of occurred to me that, while we're not intentionally doing, being part of some vision like that, we're kind of doing that in the midst of this strange world. We're doing something here that appears kind of strange to the outside world, probably, but we're maintaining a kind of culture and a tradition of zazen, of sesshin, of awakening, and we're doing that in a very particular way. And just the fact that we're putting forth that effort and holding something together in the midst of all of everything else around us is kind of, it's significant. And we, of course, are moving in and out and hopefully bringing something of this concentrated experience of interconnection and insight and compassion into our families and workplaces and whatever else we're doing outside of here. Okay, so that was a whole hour, and I did not expect to be able to talk that long. But that's where I'll stop. And if anyone has something to say or ask about any of that, then please go ahead. Okay, Owen?
I think you probably misquoted me. I'm sure you missed some profanity I had in there.
It was profound.
Thank you. Did you hear profound or I said profanity?
Profanity.
Yeah.
Oh, profanity. Oh. Okay, yeah, I dropped the profanity.
Very kind of you, thank you. When Hoko was giving her talk a few weeks ago, she was describing how, of course, there's the kind of obvious, I think, interconnectedness of the cook working to enable, whoever's sitting in Sesshin in the Zendo. And I thought kind of an equally intuitive counterpart to that is we're all sitting zazen to enable the cook to cook. And I wonder if just kind of framing it or organizing it that way brings anything to your mind as you're thinking so much about food and as far as you've been in that position so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge kind of turn. I Hoko said that once to me, and I think, well, I don't know if it was during a talk, but I remember Hoko saying about her own experience as a Tenzo, she would often, get practitioners would come up to her and say, "Oh, thank you so much for taking care of us, for cooking, for doing all those meals, and so thank you for cooking." And she would say, "Thank you for eating," because if there was no one to receive, she wouldn't be able to take up that practice. And that is a way of reminding us that yes, the cooking is the practice just as much as sitting. It may be oriented somewhat differently or very differently sometimes, but it is still Sesshin. It was helpful also, I think during Hoko's talk the last few times ago, she quoted Todo-san talking about being the cook and how all of the elements of the kitchen are part of your samadhi as the cook. So all of the implements, all of the food, all the cutting boards, and everything that you're doing is kind of one activity. And if you widen it a little more, the people sitting are also part of that activity. And if we can extend that into the garden, if the garden is part of the samadhi, we start sort of just eventually widening the circle until all beings are with us. And so, yeah.
And then that's very related to the other thing I was thinking. So, maybe there's a way that you can relate to your, DoorDash, whatever, in a comparatively nyoho way by being aware of the interconnectedness, by trying to be grateful, receive it as an offering, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I think I find myself, maybe trying to do that, at least if I'm in a relatively put together spot. And I think what's interesting is you're thinking through the kind of lines of interconnectedness, and the buck stops somewhere, right? So maybe I had DoorDash sometime last week, and I think I can recall it was a real rainy, crappy day, so I felt kind of bad for the driver, and then I felt kind of bad for whatever situation makes them need to do this additional labor because now they have a family to take care of, they're not getting enough money, and then I feel kind of bad for whatever global, and then somewhere you just kind of get tired of the chain interconnectedness, right? And that's very, I think, depending on your mood, your energy, your just individual personality. And I wonder if you have an idea about seeing it perhaps a little bit more expansively or a little bit more open-endedly as opposed to, After global capitalism, I'm done.
Seeing it in a more open-ended, well, yeah, I mean, there's a way in which when you try to tease out all of the actual interconnections, it just becomes impossible. And if it involves also sort of suffering in the sense that, oh, how is this banana causing harm? Then it can be paralyzing. It can be, and just disorienting. So I think part of it, maybe I should have titled this talk "Living in a Funyo World," because I think part of it is just realizing that the world, that we do live in that world, where people aren't, why does cabbage grown, a mile away cost several dollars more than one that was grown 1,000 miles away and went through all these different processes and pesticides and all of that stuff and fossil fuel transport and all of that stuff. We have to kind of accept it at the same time as we do anything otherwise, and not be rigid and seeing, I mean, we can see those levels of interconnection regardless of where the food came from. I was watching a YouTube video recently and someone was talking about, I think they were talking about the loneliness epidemic and social media, and they said, we live in a world that is more interconnected than ever before, but we're still isolated. But what occurred to me is that actually the world is not any more interconnected than it ever was. Interconnection is just reality. It's just that we can get a cabbage from China easily, or things. The way that interconnection is manifesting right now is seemingly brings faraway places nearer. But ultimately, we can we can experience interconnection on any level, and it's always been functioning. So that kind of relieves some of that for me.
Yeah, and as you're talking, it's occurring to me that maybe if I'd been in a brighter mood, that $3 that went to that guy, well, maybe that's a nice little Reese's cup for his kid, and then maybe that kid who was crying from being bullied at school have a nice evening now, or what. You can tell both stories just as easily, right? And that's, I think, the curious part, being able to maintain that equanimity and, I think what you're describing is matter-of-factness, that, whatever your kind of psychological state is, both aspects and any other are all just as real, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So just comment. So I thank you for the talk. I appreciate it. I've been working in the kitchen in this temple, and then I was tenzo in other temples too. So first, I started to cook here, and then Sawyer is very conscious about locally sourcing, and then so I'm from city, and then so in Brooklyn we just went to supermarket, so where I was, so it was like inconvenient to go to like a local store. Supermarket has everything. That's, so, but then when we started to source vegetables from local farmers, and then they actually brought vegetables to my house or this temple, and then we connect with vegetable with person. I know this vegetables from Eliza and Jake, and these vegetables from Nick and Mary, and these are from Eric and Rose. So we know these farmers, and then we have more connection to the people who put so much effort into making vegetables, and then so the vegetables are naturally beautiful and then tasty. So I now appreciate more. And if I go to Farm Stop has all different kind of local farms bring their vegetables to there. So each vegetable has their name, the farm's name. So, I'm getting this vegetable from this farm, So they have like a more like a human connection, interconnectedness in a very visible way. It used to be like we had in Japan too. There's a little small vegetable store, small fruit store, and then you go to these stores and talk to the people who make them, who get them, and then so we had the connection. But when we go to supermarket now, you're not talking to anybody. You even just go to like a self checkout. You ended up not talking to anybody. You don't know where these vegetables are coming from, and there's no appreciation. So it's like, okay, So I kind of like feel like a different way of understanding food and the connection as I started to work here. And then there was another thing I thought about, like the recipes. You can look online, and then. But I was fortunate to receive training from another Tenzo. Tenzo is the head of the kitchen in Brooklyn, and also from Tasahara too, and other places. So it's always like warm hand to warm hand. So it's not like a written instruction. There you go. You see the Tenzo, the head of kitchen working, and you learn from how they're working and working together. So that's I feel a little bit missed in this opportunity, because we have so tiny kitchen. There's one person can only work, so you can't really hand down the skills and techniques and the knowledge into it. So that's something, we used to do that, mothers to children or fathers to children. You have this family meal handed down generations. But now you go online, you never cooked before. I'm living with people who never cooked tofu in their life before. So, they don't know how to cook tofu, and they don't know how to chop vegetables. So our house is not, the low-income housing. So we get like a big grocery, the bulk orders. And then the people can use already cut vegetables very well, like a broccoli floret or cauliflower floret. But then if they get the big one, they don't know what to do with it. So it's like, oh no. So like all the vegetables ended up staying in the fridge and get bad. So it's like all these connections getting lost, So even family level, they're so busy they don't even have time to teach how to cook. They don't even cook together in their kitchen, and then so that's happening all over the world. So also you already mentioned it, so I'm just gonna make a very quick comment. So this color, 5 colors, red, white, green, yellow, 6, and 6 tastes sweet, salty, bitter, spicy, creamy, sour. That's naturally take care of our body. That those colors, if we have this kind of a naturally think of, okay, maybe this color, so then your body can absorb different kinds of mineral, vitamins, nutrients. So, it's not like, oh, it has to have this color, you know. So like what you said, like you have to, you know, this knowledge, and then you can let go, and then naturally you have more experience of take care of your food in very nutritious way with, you know, this, that's how it was made. Thank you.
Would anyone on Zoom like to make a comment? Guess not.
Oh, Neil.
So yeah, I appreciate the discussion of the DoorDash situation, but it reminded me also when you were talking about the quote about Sesshin and how when we pay a fee that it may be harder to receive that food like as a gift. And I like the idea of trying to cultivate gratitude like for the food that we receive. But I think like maybe part of the problem is in this kind of more impersonal, transactional way that we live, that it's hard to see that the money that I have, like I might see that as mine, you know, and so I am trading it for food. And so I think it's sometimes hard to also just appreciate that as a gift and then to offer that, especially if we're not really interacting in person. So I think, yeah, we might live in a culture that's more interconnected, but one that creates those connections by stripping out the human connections of like local grocers. And, so yeah, I think it's different if I have a regular DoorDasher, or, which is not my life, I live in a small town, but in my self-checkout, there are 2 or 3 people that work that at our Kroger, and so there is a sense of personal connection there.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, we have to take what we can get in terms of connection. And yeah, I think that the idea of seeing how even money itself is not mine. It's something that is circulating, and it represents kind of a problem. Is that it represents resources, and it's this like just intangible, basically, thing that represents the ability to ultimately pull resources out of the ground. And when those, you know, money flows around, that's why we're digging up the earth. But also it is just part of the exchange of all beings, and so when you pay a fee, it's also part of Sesshin. You know, we can't do it in this world. We can't do that without paper money, or at least numbers on a screen. So that's real.
And to kind of just give another framing or language for what you're saying, Marx has a really beautiful phrase in Capital where he describes how by putting a price on all the goods and services that we buy, this kind of illusion happens where rather than I spend half an hour talking to somebody about their problems in exchange for you driving me my chicken sandwich, we could say that chicken sandwich is $5. And like they're both true, but to what you're saying, we forget that there's like an actually very real human activity kind of behind the circulation of money, right? Which is how alienation happens, and that's how you get the communist revolution, right? Hopefully.
I just want to say one thing. If you were done, Owen.
Yeah.
It seems like kind of what we're talking about, and this occurs to me, is that so much of our food now is transactional. I have a friend, he's a Frenchman, and the guy literally looks for mushrooms while riding his bicycle. He looks for food all the time. He gives my wife food all the time. He gives his neighbors food all the time. And he's an incredible cook. I don't think he buys much. I think he is the ultimate forager, at least in this town. I should introduce you to him. But it just seems like there is that real difference between what happens in this modern world as real transaction to get food, as opposed to like in my parents' time, they grew so much of their food. You know, I'm sure you live in a city, you had to buy your food, but I grew up with lots of gardens and we had livestock, and so there were periods of time where we didn't have to go to the store. So just want to point that out.
Thank you.
There's somebody Stefan.
Oh, Stefan.
Very nourishing talk. Thank you very much.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall we close things?